Charlotte sat alone at the dining table, her fingers tracing the rim of her untouched coffee cup. The house, once filled with warmth and laughter, now echoed with an unbearable silence. Brandon had left early that morning for yet another business trip, his goodbye nothing more than a distracted kiss on the forehead as he skimmed through emails on his phone. It had been years since they'd truly sat down and talked, really talked. Not just exchanged pleasantries about schedules and responsibilities. The loneliness had crept in slowly, like a shadow growing longer with each passing day. She had always understood his ambitions, always supported his work, but somewhere along the way, she had become INV. Her only solace was Brian, though even he had begun to drift away. He was a man now, independent, focused on carving out his own path. She admired that about him, yet his growing distance only deepened her solitude. The house felt emptier than ever, the silence pressing against her chest like a weight she couldn't shake. She longed for something, anything, to fill the void, but as she sat in that quiet room, staring at the empty chair across from her, she realized she had never felt so. Charlotte stood by the window, watching the soft morning light filter through the trees, casting long golden streaks on the kitchen floor. The house was still, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of settling wood. She had grown used to these quiet mornings, the ones where Brandon was already gone before she even opened her eyes. But today, her thoughts weren't on her absent husband. Instead, they drifted to Brian. She remembered when he was little, how he'd wake up early just to sit with her at the breakfast table. His tiny hands wrapped around a warm cup of milk, chattering about everything from superheroes to schoolyard adventures. Now, he barely spoke more than a few words before heading off to work at the cafe down the street. He was growing into his own life, independent and determined, yet Charlotte couldn't shake the worry that clung to her heart. Was he truly happy? Did he regret leaving college? Was he choosing this path because he wanted to or because he felt lost? She knew she had no right to question his choices. He was an adult, after all, but a mother's love was not so easily set aside. She wanted to protect him, to guide him, to make sure he knew that no matter how far he strayed, he would always have a home, a place where he was safe and loved. But lately, she wasn't sure if he even needed her anymore, and that thought hurt more than she expected. The afternoon heat pressed against the walls of the house, thick and unrelenting. Charlotte wiped the sweat from her brow, sighing as she made her way toward the bathroom, eager for a cool shower to chase away the sweltering discomfort. As she approached, she heard the steady rush of water and hesitated, realizing Brian was already inside. Just as she turned to leave, a small gap in the door caught her eye, a sliver of space where the light filtered through, where movement flickered behind the misted glass. She should have looked away, should have walked back down the hall without another thought, but she didn't. For the briefest moment, she saw him, his back turned, shoulders strong, water streaming down his skin. The sight was fleeting, but it sent a shock through her. Something unfamiliar, something she couldn't name. Her heart lurched in her chest, the air thick in her throat. This was wrong. She knew it was wrong. And yet, for that single, breathless instant, she couldn't move. A part of her, one she didn't recognize, stirred beneath the weight of her loneliness, filling the empty spaces she had long ignored. Then, as if waking from a trance, her foot shifted, knocking against the mop propped against the wall. It clattered to the floor, the sound slicing through the thick silence. Panic surged through her. She turned on her heel, retreating down the hall before he could notice, her pulse hammering with something she refused to acknowledge. Charlotte sat in the dim glow of the living room, her fingers absently tracing the rim of her glass of water. The ice had long since melted, but she hadn't taken a sip. Her mind was elsewhere, trapped in an endless loop of emotions she couldn't untangle. She had convinced herself that what happened earlier was nothing, a fleeting mistake, a trick of the mind born from exhaustion and solitude. But the truth clung to her like a shadow, lingering even as she tried to push it away. She had spent years suppressing her own needs, prioritizing Brandon's work, Brian's growth, the day-to-day motions of being a wife and mother. She had become so accustomed to fading into the background that she hadn't noticed how much she had disappeared. And now, here she was, shaken by something she didn't understand, something she didn't want to understand. Brian returned from his shift, his presence filling the quiet space with an ease that should have comforted her, but instead, it unsettled her. She found herself hyper-aware of him, the way he moved through the kitchen, the casual way he ran a hand through his damp hair. Had she always noticed these things, or was it only now, after that moment, that her mind refused to look away? Guilt gnawed at her, and yet there was something else beneath it, something unspoken, something dangerous. She closed her eyes and took a slow breath, willing herself to forget, but she knew she wouldn't. The morning light poured through the sheer curtains, casting soft patterns across the living room floor. Charlotte sat on the couch, a book resting open on her lap. Though she hadn't turned the page in over 10 minutes, she felt Brian's presence before he spoke, the weight of his gaze settling on her like an unspoken question. "Mom," he said finally, his voice quiet but deliberate, "did you watch me yesterday?" The words sent a sharp tremor through her, her hands tightening on the book's edges. She forced herself to look at him, but the moment their eyes met, she felt exposed, as if he could see every thought she had tried to bury. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice lighter than she felt. "Brian didn't blink. I heard the mop fall, and I knew you were there before that." A rush of heat spread through her chest, embarrassment twisting her insides. She wanted to deny it, to laugh it off as a misunderstanding, but she couldn't find the words. The silence between them stretched, heavy and unyielding. Then, in a voice softer than before, he said, "I didn't mind." Charlotte's breath caught, her heart hammering against her ribs. There was no accusation in his tone, no shame, only something quiet and unreadable. She should have ended this conversation, should have dismissed it, but instead, she sat frozen, trapped between the past she knew and the future she feared, and in that moment, everything changed. Charlotte stood at the kitchen sink, her hands submerged in warm, soapy water, but her mind was far from the dishes she was washing. The house was too quiet, the weight of her own thoughts pressing down on her chest. She had spent the last 24 hours trying to reason with herself, trying to pretend that Brian's words had not shaken something loose inside her. But the truth was impossible to ignore. Every glance, every accidental touch, every moment of silence between them now carried an undercurrent of something neither of them dared to name. She had spent so many years feeling invisible, her existence defined by duty, first as a wife, then as a mother, and now, here was Brian, standing at the edge of something forbidden, looking at her in a way no one had in a very long time. She felt him before she saw him. He was close, too close. His presence behind her sent a shiver up her spine. Slowly, she turned, finding him leaning against the counter, his eyes searching hers. "This isn't right," she whispered, more to herself than to him. Brian didn't move, but his gaze remained steady. "Then why does it feel like it is?" Charlotte's breath hitched, guilt curled in her stomach, warring with something far more dangerous. She should have stepped away. She should have said something final, something firm, but she didn't. Instead, she stood there, drowning in the unspoken truth between them. Charlotte sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the framed wedding photo on her nightstand. She traced the outline of Brandon's face with her eyes, the way he had once looked at her with quiet admiration, the way his hand had held hers so firmly as if promising never to let go. Somewhere along the way, that promise had faded into long business trips, hurried conversations, and an emptiness she had never dared to acknowledge until now. She exhaled slowly, pressing her fingers against her temples. This had to stop, whatever had ignited between her and Brian, whatever loneliness had led her here. It had to end before it unraveled everything. She had spent years keeping her family together, being the steady, reliable one. She couldn't destroy it all because she had lost herself along the way. That evening, as Brian walked into the living room, she met his gaze with a quiet resolve. "We can't do this," she said, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest. Brian's expression shifted, something breaking in his eyes. He looked as though he wanted to argue, but he didn't. Instead, he simply nodded, his shoulders slumping ever so slightly. The silence that followed felt heavier than any words they could have exchanged. And just like that, the fragile, dangerous thing that had existed between them began to dissolve. Charlotte turned away, forcing herself to breathe. She had made her choice. Now, she just had to learn how to live with it. Charlotte stood on the back porch, the crisp evening air wrapping around her like a quiet embrace. The sky stretched wide above her, painted in deep hues of twilight, the first stars blinking awake. She took a slow breath, feeling the weight in her chest begin to settle. If only slightly, it had been days since she had made her decision, since she had drawn the line that should have never been crossed. The house felt different now, quieter, yet lighter in a way she hadn't expected. Brian had left that morning, saying he needed time, space to clear his head. She hadn't argued, she had simply nodded, understanding that this distance was necessary. That healing required space. She missed him already, not in the way that had blurred the boundaries between them, but as a mother missing her son, longing for the ease and simplicity they once had. She pressed a hand to her heart, feeling its steady rhythm. Guilt still lingered, but alongside it was something else. Gratitude. Gratitude that she had found the strength to stop before they lost themselves completely. Gratitude that Brian would have the chance to move forward without carrying the weight of their mistakes. A soft breeze rustled through the trees, and for the first time in a long while, she let herself smile, however faintly. This wasn't the ending she had imagined, but maybe it was the one she needed. A chance to rebuild, to forgive, and, in time, to let go. In today's world, loneliness and emotional neglect can creep into even the most structured lives. Especially in relationships where routine replaces connection. It's easy to seek comfort in the wrong places when we feel unseen or unfulfilled. But real strength comes from recognizing those feelings and addressing them in healthy ways. If you find yourself longing for something missing, focus on communication, talk to your partner, reconnect with yourself, and seek support in the right places. Boundaries matter, and self-awareness is key. True fulfillment doesn't come from fleeting emotions, but from choosing what nurtures your heart without regret.